I don't think I stayed because I was happy. At least, that's not the explanation I used at the time. If someone had asked me back then why I was still there, I probably would have said something reasonable, something calm, something that made the situation sound balanced. We're just going through a quiet phase. Or, every relationship settles down eventually. Things like that. The kinds of sentences people say when they're trying to make something feel normal, even if they're not completely sure it is. But the truth, the version of the truth I only started admitting to myself much later, is simpler than that. I stayed because leaving felt dramatic, and I didn't think anything between us was dramatic enough to justify it. At least not at first. When we met, nothing about it felt intense. That's probably why I trusted it. We met through mutual friends at a small dinner. Not a party. Just one of those evenings where someone's apartment fills up with too many chairs pulled from different rooms and everyone ends up talking over each other. She wasn't loud. That's the first thing I noticed. In a room full of people trying to be interesting, she seemed comfortable just listening. Not shy exactly, just selective about when she spoke. At some point, we ended up sitting next to each other on the couch. I don't remember the transition. One moment we were part of the group conversation, and the next we were quietly having our own. She asked questions slowly, not rapid fire the way people sometimes do when they're trying to keep things lively. More like she actually wanted the answer. I remember telling her something about my job and realizing halfway through that I was explaining it more honestly than I usually did. She didn't interrupt. She didn't jump in with her own story immediately. She just listened, and that felt rare. By the end of the night, we had exchanged numbers. Nothing dramatic about that either. Just a quiet understanding that we'd probably talk again. The beginning was easy. Not exciting in the way movies make it look. Just comfortable. We started texting occasionally. Then more often. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long walks where conversation stretched longer than either of us planned. It felt steady, predictable in a way that felt safe. There wasn't a moment where we declared anything official. We just kept seeing each other. And eventually, not seeing each other would have felt strange. I remember a night about 2 months in when we were sitting on her balcony. It was late. The city was quiet in that way it gets after midnight, when most windows have gone dark. She was talking about something small that had happened at work. Not complaining exactly. Just describing the way her coworker had misunderstood something and how awkward the conversation became afterward. I realized halfway through the story that she was describing it with a lot of detail. Little pauses. Small expressions she remembered. The tone of the other person's voice. And I remember thinking something simple. She trusts me with the boring parts of her day. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. Because there's something intimate about the ordinary. When someone feels comfortable enough to narrate their life while it's still unfolding. Not just the important moments. The quiet ones too. For a while, that's how everything felt. Like we were gradually letting each other into the background of our lives. Not trying too hard. Not rushing. Just including each other. We started spending weekends together. Groceries. Cooking dinner. Watching shows we half paid attention to. The kind of routine that builds slowly enough that you don't notice it forming until it's already there. I like that. The calmness of it. I had been in relationships before that burned too bright in the beginning. This felt different. Less dramatic. More stable. And I thought stability meant we were doing something right. Looking back now, I think the first changes were too small to notice clearly. Not events. Just slight adjustments in tone. She started getting quieter during conversations. Not all the time. Just occasionally. Moments where she would nod instead of responding. Or change the subject when something personal drifted into the conversation. At first I told myself it didn't mean anything. Everyone has quiet days. Everyone gets tired. It would have felt strange to treat those moments like signals of something larger. So I didn't. I let them pass. Months went by. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. We still saw each other regularly. We still texted during the day. We still had dinner together several nights a week. If someone had looked at our relationship from a distance, they would have seen two people doing normal couple things. Which is exactly why leaving never crossed my mind in a serious way. Because leaving requires a reason. At least that's what I believed. Something clear. A fight. A betrayal. A moment you can point to and say, that's when it stopped working. We didn't have anything like that. What we had was quieter. More subtle. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching something neither of us was really paying attention to. She was scrolling on her phone. I was half listening to the television. At some point, I started telling her a story about something that had happened at work earlier that day. Nothing important. Just a strange conversation I'd had with a coworker. Halfway through the story, I noticed she hadn't reacted. No laugh. No question. Nothing. She was still scrolling. I paused for a second, waiting, but she didn't notice the pause. So I finished the story anyway. She nodded when I finished. Yeah, that sounds annoying. Then she kept scrolling. It wasn't rude. It wasn't even unusual. But something about that moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Because it felt like the first time I realized she wasn't really inside the conversation. Just nearby. I didn't say anything about it. Not that night. Not later either. Because the truth is, it didn't seem like enough to justify a conversation. No one had done anything wrong. It was just a small moment. The kind of thing that happens in long relationships all the time. People get comfortable. They pay less attention sometimes. That's normal. At least that's what I told myself. And telling myself that felt easier than asking the question that was slowly forming underneath the surface. Over time, those moments became slightly more frequent. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed them. She started answering questions more briefly. Sometimes she seemed distracted even when we were sitting right next to each other. We still talked, but the conversations felt shorter. More practical. What time we'd meet. What we needed from the store. Plans for the weekend. Logistics. The emotional parts of conversation appeared less often. And because they appeared less often, it became harder to bring them up naturally. I remember one night when we were lying in bed, lights off, both staring at the ceiling. I thought about asking her something real. Not confrontational, just honest. Something like, do you feel the same about us as you did before? But the moment felt fragile. Like if I asked the question, I might introduce a problem that didn't exist yet. Or worse, confirm one that already did. So I stayed quiet. And after a few minutes, she turned over and fell asleep. I listened to her breathing for a while in the dark, thinking about how strange it is that you can lie inches away from someone and still feel unsure about what they're thinking. I stayed because nothing had broken. That's the simplest explanation. Leaving felt like something you do when a relationship collapses. When something dramatic happens. When the situation becomes impossible to ignore. But our relationship never collapsed. It just slowly thinned. Like a conversation fading into background noise. And background noise is easy to live with. You adjust to it. You stop noticing it. Sometimes friends would ask how things were going between us. I always said the same thing. Good. Not enthusiastically, but honestly enough that it didn't feel like a lie. Because parts of it were still good. We still laughed sometimes. We still enjoyed each other's company on certain days. It wasn't misery. It was something more confusing than that. It was neutral. And neutral is hard to leave. I think the moment everything became clear happened on a completely ordinary evening. We were having dinner at her place, talking about plans for the upcoming weekend. The conversation was calm, predictable, safe. And while she was describing something about meeting a friend the next day, I realized something quietly unsettling. I wasn't really listening. Not because I didn't care. Because the conversation felt like something we were both performing. Two people continuing a script that had become familiar. And in that moment, I realized something else. She probably felt the same way. Not bored. Not unhappy. Just slightly disconnected. Like two people who had grown comfortable sharing space, but stopped sharing themselves. After dinner, we cleaned up together. She washed dishes while I dried them. A small domestic routine we had done dozens of times before. Nothing about it felt tense. But something inside me had shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough that I noticed my own thoughts becoming quieter. Like I had stopped waiting for something to change. We stayed together for a few more months after that. Out of habit. Out of familiarity. Out of the quiet belief that relationships sometimes go through periods like this and eventually find their way back. Maybe some do. I don't know. Ours didn't. The end came just as quietly as everything else had. A calm conversation on a Sunday afternoon. No anger. No accusations. Just two people acknowledging something that had already been true for a while. That whatever we had once been building had stopped growing. Sometimes people ask if the breakup was difficult, and I never know how to answer that. It wasn't devastating, but it wasn't easy either. It felt more like letting go of something that had already been slipping out of your hands slowly for months. By the time we said the words out loud, most of the emotional work had already happened silently. Now when I think about that relationship, what stands out isn't the ending. It's how long we both stayed after we had quietly stopped meeting each other in the same place. Neither of us wanted to create drama where there wasn't any. Neither of us wanted to be the person who disrupted the calm surface of things. So we stayed, until staying felt more natural than leaving. And leaving finally felt necessary. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had asked that question earlier. The one I thought about in the dark that night. Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe everything would have. There's no way to know now. But I do know this. Not every relationship ends because something terrible happens. Sometimes it ends because two people slowly become quieter around each other, and neither one notices how much space has grown between them. And for a long time, I mistook that quiet space for stability. Until one day I realized it was something else. Something softer. Something easier to ignore. But not something you can stay inside forever. And by the time I understood that clearly, leaving didn't feel dramatic anymore. It just felt honest. Sometimes I still think about the months between the moment I first noticed the distance and the moment we finally admitted it out loud. That stretch of time feels strange in my memory. Not painful exactly, just quiet. Like walking through a long hallway where nothing dramatic happens, but you still remember the feeling of moving through it. Because that's what it was. A long hallway. And both of us kept walking through it like everything was normal. After that Sunday conversation, the one where we calmly agreed something had changed, there wasn't an immediate separation. That's another detail people usually find surprising. We didn't break up that day. We just acknowledged the thing we had both been avoiding, which somehow made everything feel both clearer and more complicated at the same time. Because once you say something like that out loud, you can't completely ignore it anymore. But it also doesn't immediately erase everything that already exists between two people. For a while, we kept seeing each other. Not in the exact same way as before. Something about the dynamic had shifted, but we were still part of each other's routines. Still texting occasionally. Still meeting for dinner sometimes. If someone had looked at us from the outside, they probably wouldn't have noticed the difference. But internally, everything felt slightly more honest. Because we had finally stopped pretending the relationship was exactly what it used to be. And oddly enough, that honesty made those last months feel calmer than the ones before. I remember one evening a few weeks later. We were walking through a park near her apartment. It was late autumn, cold enough that most people had already stopped sitting outside, but not cold enough that walking felt uncomfortable. The trees were almost bare, leaves scattered across the paths. We were talking about something small, I think a movie she had watched the night before. And halfway through the conversation, she stopped walking. Not dramatically, just paused. Then she said something I still remember very clearly. I think we both knew before we said it. I knew exactly what she meant. That slow realization. The quiet awareness that had been forming for months before either of us named it. I nodded. Neither of us said much after that. But the silence didn't feel tense. It felt accurate. Like we had finally caught up to something that had been happening in the background for a long time. After that, things continued to fade in small ways. Our messages became less frequent. Our plans less automatic. Neither of us made a conscious decision to stop. It just happened gradually, the same way the relationship itself had slowly changed months earlier, which, looking back, feels strangely consistent. Nothing about our story was abrupt. Everything happened in quiet transitions. There was one night near the very end when I was sitting in my apartment alone, scrolling through old messages on my phone, not intentionally looking for anything specific, just revisiting them. Sometimes people say that reading old conversations makes them feel nostalgic. But that wasn't the feeling I had. What struck me most was how normal everything sounded. The jokes, the small daily updates, the routine goodnight messages, all the things that once felt meaningful. And yet, when I read them again, I realized something strange. None of those messages explained why we stayed together. And none of them explained why we eventually drifted apart. They were just fragments of time. Evidence that two people shared space in each other's days for a while. But not necessarily evidence that we truly understood each other deeply. I don't say that with regret. At least not anymore. Because the truth is, not every relationship exists to become something permanent. Some relationships exist simply because two people meet at the same moment in their lives when they both need a certain kind of connection. Not intense. Not transformative. Just steady company for a while. And maybe that's what we were for each other. Company. The last time I saw her felt almost ordinary. We met for coffee, sat at the same small table we had used dozens of times before. The conversation moved easily enough. Work updates, friends, random observations about things happening around us. Nothing heavy, nothing unresolved. But underneath the conversation, there was a quiet understanding. Neither of us was pretending anymore. We were simply acknowledging that whatever we had once been building together had already reached its natural end. At some point, she looked at the clock and said she needed to go. We stood outside the cafe for a moment. Then we hugged. Not the kind of hug people share when something dramatic ends. Just a calm, familiar one. When we stepped back, neither of us rushed to fill the silence with final words. We just nodded. And then she walked in one direction. I walked in the other. After that day, we didn't speak again. Not because we decided not to. Just because the rhythm that once connected us had already faded. There was nothing left pushing the conversation forward. And neither of us tried to restart it. Sometimes people imagine breakups as loud moments. Arguments. Crying. Doors closing. But ours wasn't like that. It was quieter than almost every other relationship ending I've seen. And for a long time, I wondered if that meant something about us had been incomplete. Like maybe relationships that end calmly weren't as real. But the older I get, the less I believe that. Because calm endings can still carry weight. They just carry it differently. More like a slow exhale than an explosion. Now, when I think about that relationship, the thing I remember most clearly isn't the distance that eventually appeared between us. It's the beginning. That night on her balcony. The way she described the awkward conversation with her coworker in such careful detail. The way she trusted me with those ordinary moments. Those memories still feel warm. Not sad. Just distant. Like a place I once visited for a while. And sometimes I think about the reason I stayed as long as I did. Not because I was trapped. Not because I was afraid. But because leaving felt like something people do when something dramatic happens. And nothing dramatic ever happened between us. Just a slow shift. Two people becoming quieter around each other. Two lives slowly moving in slightly different directions. At the time, that didn't feel like a good enough reason to leave. But eventually I realized something. Sometimes the quietest changes are the most important ones. Even when they're easy to ignore. And maybe that's the part one had to learn the hard way. That relationships don't always end because something explodes. Sometimes they end because something slowly fades. And for a long time, I stayed inside that fading space, simply because leaving it felt too dramatic. Until one day it didn't. Until one day it just felt like the most honest thing left to do. And even now, when I think about it late at night, I don't feel anger. I don't feel regret. I just remember the quiet hallway we walked through together. And how long it took both of us to realize we had already reached the end of it. Sometimes I try to remember the exact day when I stopped expecting things to return to the way they were. Not the day we ended things. That part is easy to remember. I mean the day when the small hope, the quiet belief that things might somehow shift back into place, finally disappeared. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a realization that felt sharp or painful. It was more like noticing that a sound you had been listening for in the background had been gone for a while, and you hadn't even realized it. There was a period, maybe a few weeks after that last coffee, when I still caught myself reaching for my phone automatically. Not to text her exactly, just to check. Like my mind hadn't completely updated yet. You spend enough time sharing daily routines with someone, and your brain builds little habits around them. Morning messages, evening check-ins, small things like that. When those habits disappear, your body still expects them for a while. Like muscle memory. I remember one morning I woke up earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet. Sunlight coming through the window in that soft way it does before the day fully begins. And without thinking, I reached for my phone. For a second, I almost opened our old conversation. Then I paused, because I realized something. I wasn't expecting a message. I wasn't hoping for one either. The reflex was just leftover motion. And when that thought landed, I set the phone back down on the nightstand. Not dramatically, just calmly. Like putting something away after realizing you don't actually need it anymore. That moment stayed with me for a while. Not because it was sad. Because it felt like the first honest signal that something inside me had shifted too. When a relationship ends quietly, there isn't always a clear emotional release. There's no explosion. No moment where everything breaks and you suddenly start rebuilding. Instead, the emotions dissolve slowly. Almost invisibly. Like fog lifting in the early morning. You don't see it happening. You just look up one day and realize the air is clearer. For a long time after that, I thought about the idea of drama. About how much we associate endings with intensity. People expect relationships to end with shouting, betrayal, or heartbreak that feels impossible to miss. But real life doesn't always work like that. Sometimes the most important endings happen so quietly that you almost miss them. Sometimes two people simply stop moving toward each other, and nothing forces them back together again. There's something strange about that kind of ending. It leaves fewer scars, but it also leaves more questions. Because when something explodes, you understand why it ended. You can point to the moment, the argument, the decision. But when something fades, you're left with a softer kind of uncertainty. Not confusion exactly, more like curiosity. A quiet wondering about all the small moments that slowly shifted things in one direction instead of another. I used to replay those moments in my head. The first time I noticed her distracted during a conversation. The nights when we both stayed silent instead of asking deeper questions. The times I thought about saying something honest and decided not to. For a while I treated those memories like clues, trying to piece together the exact sequence that led us to the ending. But eventually I realized something. There wasn't a single turning point. There were hundreds of tiny ones, and none of them looked important while they were happening. I think that's why I stayed as long as I did. Because each individual moment felt too small to react to, too subtle to call a problem, too ordinary to justify leaving. Leaving felt like something you do when the situation becomes impossible to ignore. But our situation was always easy to ignore. That's what made it last. Sometimes I wonder if she experienced the same quiet process from her side. If she had moments lying in bed at night when she thought about asking a question and decided not to. If she noticed the small distance growing between us before I did. Or if it happened differently for her. I've never asked. And at this point, it doesn't really matter. Because whatever version of the story she carries now probably feels just as real as mine. There's a strange kind of respect that grows out of relationships like that. Not the intense gratitude people talk about after dramatic love stories. Something quieter. An understanding that two people once shared a part of their lives honestly, even if the connection didn't last forever. And that's enough. I still walk past places in the city that remind me of her sometimes. The cafe where we spent too many Sunday mornings. The park where we had that conversation in late autumn. The grocery store where we once argued gently about which pasta sauce to buy. None of those memories feel painful anymore. They just feel complete, like chapters in a book that ended where it needed to end. Every once in a while I catch myself thinking about that idea again. The reason I stayed. How strange it sounds when I say it out loud now. I stayed because leaving felt dramatic. At the time, that explanation made perfect sense. I believed relationships required big reasons to end. Something obvious. Something undeniable. But now I understand something I didn't understand then. Sometimes the quiet reasons are the most honest ones. The slow changes. The subtle distance. The realization that two people are no longer meeting in the same emotional space. Those things matter too. Even if they happen quietly. Even if no one else notices them. And when I think about it now, I don't feel like I stayed too long. Not really. Because those extra months taught me something I might not have understood otherwise. They showed me how easy it is to confuse calm with connection. And how important it is to notice when that calm becomes something else. Something hollow. Something that looks stable from the outside, but feels slightly empty when you sit inside it long enough. Now, when I meet someone new and things begin to feel easy in that same familiar way, I pay attention a little differently. Not with suspicion, just awareness. Because ease can mean comfort, but it can also mean distance. And sometimes the difference between those two things is so quiet that you only notice it if you're willing to ask the uncomfortable questions, even when asking them feels dramatic. I still believe in calm relationships, in stability, in the quiet rhythm two people can build together over time. But I also understand something now that I didn't understand then. Calm should still have presence, still have curiosity, still have moments where two people pause and ask each other what's really going on beneath the surface. Because when those moments disappear, the quiet can start to mean something different. And sometimes, the most honest thing two people can do isn't to keep pretending the quiet means everything is fine. Sometimes the honest thing is simply to recognize that the connection has changed. Even if that recognition feels uncomfortable. Even if it feels dramatic. Even if for a long time you convinced yourself it wasn't enough reason to leave. I didn't understand that when I was inside that relationship. I just kept walking down that quiet hallway with her, assuming we would eventually find another room where things felt the way they used to. But the hallway didn't lead anywhere new. It just slowly reached its end. And one day we both stopped walking. Not suddenly. Not angrily. Just naturally. Like two people who finally realized the door behind them had already closed, and the space ahead of them had grown too quiet to ignore. And that's the part one still think about sometimes. Not the ending, just the long quiet walk before it. And how easy it was to mistake that silence for stability until it wasn't.